everyone, to Grassland Ecosystems in Decline, Prairies, Savannas, Woodlands, and more. A quick reminder as we get started, please use the Q&A box on the right for all questions. The chat function can be used for all other comments. Our presenter will address as many questions as possible in the time that we have. And for any questions that we're not able to cover, this presenter will respond directly in this chat. So you can access this at any time in the agenda tab and come back to this meeting to get your questions answered. Today's presenter is Jeremy French, who is the Director of Ecological Restoration and Stewardship for the Southeastern Grasslands Institute. Jeremy is based out of Clarksville, Tennessee, and is the SGI lead and the NPS, IRA, and BIL projects. In addition to these projects, Jeremy and his team spearhead grassland conservation projects across SGI's 24-state focal region, encompassing grassland research, restoration, and reconstruction. With that being said, Jeremy, go ahead and unmute yourself and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction. First, I'm very excited to be here. I'm generally a very animated talker, so this is going to be interested doing this, over Zoom, but I'm really excited to share some cool stuff today. I do encourage everyone, this for me was an opportunity to kind of do a really cool overview of a bunch of different types of grasslands. I want there to be as much discussion and as questions as possible. So if you have a curiosity or a question, make sure to put that in the chat or ask, in the Hoove app. Additionally, I've only got like an hour here. So I want you to know it is impossible for me to cover every grassland type. So if I miss your favorite, I apologize, but I'm going to try and hit as many as I can within the allotted time. So like stated before, my name is Jeremy French. I'm the Director of Ecological Restoration and Stewardship for the Southeastern Grasslands Institute. I've been with the organization now for 7 years. I was one of the first restoration staff ever hired, and I've built this program from within. Prior to that, my formal training is in grassland ecology and population dynamics, primarily focusing on mammals and herpetofauna. I worked a lot in the Midwest, spent some time in the driftless area of Northeast Iowa and Wisconsin, spent some time in Wyoming, researching everything from mammals to snakes to one of my passions, bison. Generally, when we talk about grasslands, they're synonymous with prairies in this country. And this is a very common map that people think about when we think about grasslands in this country. And this is just a very narrow view of what grasslands truly are. I can't really tell the stories of grasslands in this country without first mentioning the myth of the squirrel. So I grew up in Southern Florida. My colleague and founder of SGI grew up in Tennessee. And although I consider Iowa now my home, because that's where my wife is from and where we visit all the time, Florida is where I was born and went through my kind of primary education. And both me and the founder, Dwayne Estes, were taught the same myth growing up in school. And this myth was that upon European settlement or colonization of the Americas, that the entire eastern United States was this giant deciduous hardwood forest. So much so that a squirrel, a very ambitious squirrel, could go from the Atlantic to the Mississippi without ever touching the ground. And once it hit the Mississippi, then it would have encountered this large expanse of grasslands. This is my least favorite myth of every myth that's out there. It's completely not based in reality or fact. So what was, the North American continent really like pre-settlement? What are the expanses of grass? To really tell this story, it takes two maps. So this map on the left is a map published by Daniel Huffman based off of NatureServe data in about 2018. And you can see here it has, you know, the tall grass prairie, Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota maps shifting into mixed grass prairies and short grass prairies. And as we get out west, you get the valley foothill grasslands and the basin steppe and the Palouse grasslands, and the California grasslands and the Chihuahuan desert grasslands and the west coast or Gulf grasslands. For its time, it kind of did a pretty good job of expanding some of our knowledge or understanding, at least at a high level, what was the expansive grasslands in the West. This had never really been done for the East. So if you look at the map on the right here that is currently in prep and will be published within the next year or so in National Geographic, this is the Southeastern Grasslands Institute's focal range. So we encompass essentially the unglaciated Southeast. Everything in green here was historically areas of large grassland communities. So when you marry these two maps together, and I want to be clear here, not everything that's shaded in either of these maps was going to absolutely be grassland or absolutely be prairie, but that those vegetation types were likely the dominant type in these areas. When you merge these two maps together, they start telling a very stunning story about the North American continent and what it truly was like pre-European settlement. And it's something that I've called, you know, the Sea of Grasslands. From the Atlantic Ocean all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, we had these extremely diverse and at times massive tapestry of grasslands that interwove into each other, that gave birth and rise to bison in the panhandle of Florida, all the way up to we have quotes of George Washington killing bison in West Virginia, to prairie chickens in Kentucky and up in Long Island, New York. It just created a different story than what we've been told. And it is the story of the continent of grass, the Sea of Grasslands. So there's some differences here that are worth pointing out between Midwestern or Western grasslands and Southeastern grasslands. So right here on the map, you have what we refer to as a dry line. Essentially everything east of that line there receives enough rainfall annually to support trees or tree growth. So here we have kind of a typical short grass, mixed grass prairie on the left, these rolling hills kind of indicative of at times the Dakotas and, you know, eastern Colorado and so forth. We have what most people think about when you talk about the Southeast, but this is actually fairly rare in the Southeast. This is a more accurate depiction of what the Southeast probably historically looked like. This tapestry of pine and oak, savanna, woodland, prairie, grasslands were very dominant. Similar in both places, these grasslands are pyrophytic in nature. They're fire adapted. They also have large relationship with the grazers, but not only grazers, browsers as well. Bison, for example, most people think of bison being on the Great Plains. We had bison all throughout the Southeast, in Georgia, Florida, the Carolinas, all the way up to in the Virginias, and not just a like short history of these bison being here, but long histories that even when we talk to our tribal friends and our tribal communities that we're building relationships with, they tell us some of their origin stories of how their origin stories in Mississippi were the tribes hunting Pleistocene fauna on the prairies of Mississippi. So long history of grazing adaptation even in the Southeast. Beaver played a huge role in the Southeast in creating grassland complexes, especially our riparian grassland complexes. Same thing in much of the West and the Midwest. And then we have edaphic conditions. So these are grasslands across their range that are really managed by soil. So either the soil is too shallow or too pH aggressive to really sustain tree growth. And it gives rise to this grassland flora that's incredibly unique. And then we have flooding grasslands, which many people tend to not think about. These river scour communities that are prairies that are sitting within rivers that are maintained by seasonal flooding. Super unique grasslands that, have the same prairie flora that you may see in either of these two pictures on the left. And then obviously in both areas here, there's a huge cultural component to our grasslands, in which they were lived and relied upon by the tribal communities in both the Midwest and the West and the Southeast. There's huge evidence for cultural burning, but I do want to communicate here that a common thread, at least in the Southeast for grasslands, is that they only existed because of cultural burning, and that's just inaccurate. Here is a map of the U.S. cloud to ground lightning strikes. These are fire igniting lightning strikes. You can see that the vast majority of these, or at least the highest concentration, are in Louisiana and Florida, with some very heavy concentration in Oklahoma and Kansas, and then relatively stable levels, high levels, all the way up through Iowa and Illinois and parts of the Great Plains. So we include that in here to really communicate that these are not just a product, these grasslands are not just a product of indigenous people. While indigenous people definitely worked hand in hand and played a huge important role in the maintenance of grasslands in this country, it's not the only thing. It's just kind of a factor there. Another idea that we have to kind of wrap our head around of grasslands across this country is we often hear them referred to as quote unquote early successional habitats. There's nothing early successional about these grasslands. These grasslands, both in the Midwest and the far West and the Southeast, for the most part, are old growth grasslands that have existed and evolved and developed for thousands of years. They don't succeed to forest. They degrade to unnatural forest at times. So understanding that we have to shift that narrative away from, oh, that's early successional habitat, to that is every bit as much of an old growth system as you would look at an old growth forest in the Pacific Northwest or in the Far East. So a really important shift there in thinking. So to try and give a better understanding of the U.S. landscape then is, okay, what did everything look like? What, if it wasn't, these forests and different things, what could it have been? So here is probably one of the most common landscapes that would have occurred throughout the East. This is a shortleaf pine oak savanna from Fort Chaffee, Arkansas. You can see a lush ground layer of forbs and grasses on this kind of rolling topography. Many of these trees on the right side, while they look spindly and small, are actually hundreds of years old and very stable system. Here we have a remnant meadow from Cades Cove in Great Smoky Mountain National Park, one of the most visited areas and the most visited national park in the world. And what you're seeing here, all these white flowers, are wild quinine. They're prairie species intermixed with some eastern gamma grass and big blue stem throughout. And this is literally a cove set within in the mountains. This is a very old grasslands. Sadly, in the country as a whole, most grasslands have been lost by 90%, some by 99%, and the majority, honestly, by 99% are just entirely gone. Grasslands also come in many shapes and sizes. They come in tiny mountainsides like this sandstone barren in the Ouachitas of Arkansas that may look very reminiscent of some goat prairies or bluff prairies in the upper Midwest over the Mississippi River. So communicating and understanding that grasslands aren't just these giant expansive landscape forms like the prairies of the Midwest and the Southeast, but they also come in small forms. They also have, like I said, these giant hundreds of square miles. This is a dry prairie in Florida that is dominated by species like Indian grass, and you can see some sable palms mixed in. This is very reminiscent of the Midwest at times, where you have just this huge expanse of grasslands that were hundreds and hundreds of square miles. And then a lot of them have old growth trees on them. So this is a shale barren near Roanoke, Virginia. These trees here record, and they're hundreds of years old. They look small and spindly, but they're on an unforgiving substrate in a fire-adapted community that doesn't allow for a ton of tree growth year in year. So they may look small and spindly, but they're a very important part of the stability and complexity of these grassland systems. And then there's also these giant treeless ancient communities like this old growth grass bald in Roan Mountain, North Carolina, that is for the most part entirely treeless and was likely grazing and megafauna maintained for thousands and thousands of years. They include a wide diversity of wetland habitats, fens, bogs, glades could be considered kind of wetlandy as well, but just really there's a stunning, striking diversity across the U.S. of the different types of grasslands that encompass within the continent. Some of them have desert-like environments like this glade here, which is kind of funny. Glades are really interesting systems in that they're hydroxeric. So at some part of the year, they are quite literally like a desert. This time of the year, they are a wetland, and they have obligate like wetland, even fauna such as the streamside salamander, which is tied to glades. So that these hydroxeric grasslands are very interesting to me. And then even in the east, we have these giant native stands of bamboo. The U.S. has multiple species of bamboo. This is a picture from Alabama, credit from the Alabama Historical Society. And these cane brakes, when upon European contact, would have occupied millions of acres. They would have been critical habitat for Carolina parakeets and passenger pigeons and black bears and tons of different critters, and Bachman sparrows. Pioneers generally hated these things because they would be so towering and dense that they would either have to walk in the middle of the creek or just avoid them entirely because they're unpassable. To give an idea of what these are like, these are native bamboos. We have a ton of invasive bamboos in the country that are a huge problem, but these are native bamboos to this country. And bamboo obviously is grass. This is a riparian grassland. And this picture here, this is from Louisiana in 1905 or 06. That is a man on a horse with this cane brake towering over his head. In many places, we would have had, in these riparian areas, we would have had these riparian woodlands and cane brakes that kind of naturally intermingled with some forested system, but also giant prairies and savannas, and they occupied this really important role. It's also a plant of huge cultural significance to just about every tribe in the Southeast. So what we're starting to kind of tie together and understand, or at least hint at as science progresses in this country, is that this kind of old view of you have one thing here and you have another thing here, and these were separate, isn't really accurate. And what we really had was this mosaic of landscapes where we had these tapestries of forest and prairie and grasslands all throughout the country. So now that I'm going to kind of just slowly walk through just some really unique types of grasslands that occur here, and just share about them, because I think it's important that we we have this very inclusive mind when we think about grassland ecosystems. So these grassland ecosystems, they occur on a continuum. What we refer to, and many others refer to, as the prairie to forest continuum. So if we start here at prairies generally, and this is a very broad, loose term that can potentially fall apart very easily depending how rigid we try to hold it. But generally, we're thinking of a grassland with few or no trees. There may be some scattered old growth, very fire adapted trees within the grassland, but generally rolling hills, slight to undulating topography, and very few trees. Kind of like this tall grass prairie in Stewart County, Tennessee. All those yellow flowers back there are likely Helianthus hirsutia or Helianthus angustifolia, a very common prairie sunflower. This is in Tennessee on Fort Campbell Army Base. Here is a sand dune prairie in Mahasset County, Iowa. So these prairies, you can see they're very short in stature. They have a mix of kind of wetland components. They would have historically had these open sand dunes that would have been maintained by wind. They also have, they tend to have, obligates such as, ornate box turtles could be very heavily tied to these sand prairies of the Midwest and even into the South, and have this very unique flora to them. Unfortunately, due to degradation and encroachment, many of these sand prairies that still exist don't have these open dune systems anymore, just because they've been allowed to be encroached on by cedars or other really aggressive shrubbing species like some of the native sumacs, creating a real challenge to maintain that true open dune, windblown dune interactions. This site is actually very interesting because right adjacent to the site was the first paved road in Iowa. It has a kind of medium history of conservation at this site, but you can see on the horizon there just this degradation due to removal of fire and removing of those wind-blown interchanges, that there's just kind of a wall of a natural forest coming through. We have salt marsh, treeless kind of prairies from Georgia into the Atlantic coast and within the Gulf Coast. These are giant grasslands that are indicative of prairies. Sometimes they burn, and really were some of the first upon European settlement to begin degrading. A lot of these were drained, they were dredged, they were canaled out, similar to the grasslands in Florida and up and down the coast to, meet the needs of the onslaught of more and more people coming through the space and needing room to graze and homestead. So this is one of the few remaining truly kind of semi-intact salt marshes in Georgia. Here's a pretty stunning picture. Whenever I show this picture to like well-seasoned grassland people, they're like, "Oh, that's planted. There's no way that's natural." This is a natural tall grass prairie called Cherokee Prairie in Arkansas. Will just kind of blow your mind to walk through. You can see rattlesnake master in the bottom right corner here. The majority of the liatris out there is Liatris pycnosteia. You can, as your eyes adjust, pick out these fine levels of just huge amounts of diversity in this super bloom here. Pretty stunning. Then we have mixed grass prairies. This is from Badlands National Park, where you're kind of on that interchange between having the tall grass prairie of what I would refer to as the East, which includes the Midwest. We're not so dry yet where we're entirely short grass prairie. So you have this mixed grass prairie, which generally elicits the imagination to view thousands and thousands and thousands of bison across this range. This would have been, some of our at least later on in settlement, the holdouts or the pictures of the West that most people think of when they think of bison. We have a short grass prairie, so we're progressing westward and getting drier and drier. Again, elicits those pictures, those huge landscapes of the West, of bison and elk and very kind of large megafauna systems. We shift back to the east here. This is Cherokee Prairie again in Arkansas. So what's interesting is a few slides ago, I showed you Cherokee Prairie. Cherokee Prairie is rather large. So these are two different grassland types that are both prairies within Cherokee Prairie. The last site was very wet and mesic. This is a much drier site. And you'll notice that there's some mounds in the back there. Those are called nepkas or pimple mounds. They're wind-blown deposits of loess and different soils. And what's very interesting is for a long time we associated that the majority of these nepkas, at least in Arkansas and the surrounding states, were very, very old. And recent analysis have showed that yes, many of them are thousands of years old, but some of them are as recent as 1,000 years old or 500 years old, which when you think of the grand scheme of things, that's not that long ago. So these grasslands were undergoing change even very recently in our long history. The dominating flower in this picture that you can see is Echinacea pallida, or pale purple coneflower, which is, most people associate with the Midwest, but we have extensively in our grasslands here as well in the Southeast. Then we get into some of our coastal grasslands, like this one at Cape Hatteras in North Carolina, taken by my colleague Reed Noss. These coastal sand dunes, grasslands, again, they would have been treeless grasslands that incorporate that, to some look very reminiscent of your typical kind of short grass, mixed grass prairie, and have very unique flora and fauna associated with them. A lot of this is when we start getting into some of our grasslands with trees. So this is a blackjack oak prairie from Fort Campbell, Kentucky. This is actually within their impact zone on the Army base. But as you look out of here, you can see silphiums and you can see just this menagerie of prairie fauna and forbs. What's very interesting to me about this specific site is that although this site has been mortared daily since the 40s, and I'm not joking about that daily, about once a month they have what's called a DONSA day, or day of no scheduled activity, where we can tour these sites, or at least try and tour these sites. This site has been literally mortared every day since the 40s, and we still have these old growth blackjack oaks persisting. And we have this prairie flora persisting, and part of that is due to the fact that you're able to have this natural fire regime because of the burning and mortars. Another good example here would be that grassland bald that we showed before. Again, you can see that it is treeless. These grasslands exist on top of generally mountaintops in the Appalachians. Were likely, or at least theorized, to be maintained by elk and bison and even mammoths at some point. Very unique flora in these grasslands. And then we get to our river scour prairies. So as you can see here, this is one of my favorite types of grasslands. I just got to introduce one of my team members to this specific grassland for the first time, and it blew her mind because you can see we are in this deep valley, generally not a topography that people associate with grassland. And we are standing in the middle of a river. All these rocks are a part of the river, and they get seasonally flooded. And as you can see, leaning across from left to right in your screen is this blade of Indian grass. And you can pick out a couple of species of blazing star in here. And these grasslands occur not just in the southeast. They have similar versions of Missouri, and Arkansas, and different parts of the country, but they're entirely maintained by flooding or scouring events. So generally the river level is pretty low. And then you have these high water situations where they scour across the rocks and make it so that trees cannot exist here because they would just get ripped out and washed downstream, and creates these very unique prairies essentially in the middle of a river. This is at Big South Fork National Park. About 70% of the world's river scour prairies occur within Big South Fork National Park, but they're also out there. And what this starts to tell a story, at least a long story, is if you look in this valley and you say, okay, how did this kind of old growth grassland come to occur in the middle of the river? And there's kind of two competing hypotheses. And one is, seed drops in the water, drifts down, you extrapolate that a million years, and maybe you congregate enough seed on these scour bars to essentially assemble this very unique ecosystem. The other option is to step back in time and look at a time, a million years ago, when the southeast in this country was dominated by grasslands, and likely a lot of these slopes here would have been either savanna or woodland. And even still today, when you walk some of these slopes in these valleys, you're finding things like post oaks and blackjack oaks and grassland orchids. So it starts telling a story that, we've largely misinterpreted as, where are the grasslands? Here's another picture of that same river scour here. Just absolutely stunning landscapes. Then we start shifting a little bit to our glades and barrens. So these are treeless grasslands that are generally edaphic in nature or soil maintained. So this is a limestone glade and woodland in the Ozark Highlands ecoregion in Missouri. You can see all the limestone very, very close to the surface. Generally, glades and barrens are very similar, with the distinction of we generally attribute barrens to be sloping, so like goat prairies and this barren here, and to have some type of slope to them, and whereas glades are relatively flat and have a hydric period. So here we have a dolomite glade from Ripley County, Missouri. You can see, what looks to be Echinacea purpurea in the near screen. And what's very interesting is sadly, because of degradation of these sites through time, when you get a picture of a glade, generally what you'll see some open area and then a stiff wall of trees, generally cedars. But what these glades would have been inset in within would have been these post oak, kind of blackjack oak, pine, woodland, savannas interfaces. But the savannas and woodlands have disappeared, and the glades have managed to hold on longer. Here's a very interesting grassland. Here is an alluvial plain sandbar barren on the Mississippi River. As you can see, very sandy soils, but dominated by really unique native grasses. Here we have a goat prairie from the driftless region of Wisconsin. You can see multiple species of Lithospermum and just general, very interesting barren type communities that are really kind of biodiversity powerhouses. Oftentimes these barrens and glades are small, or they may have a larger complex of glades and barrens, but because of their unique soils or their unique exposures, they have tons and tons of biodiversity. And this is something that I'm extremely excited about, that we're just kind of starting to wrap our head around. So this is what we would consider a vertical grassland, this cliff face here in Cumberland Gap. One of my team members, Elena Krakowiak, has spent the last year or so rappelling these and getting the flora from these sites. So here we have a big blue stem, literally just, what everyone thinks of the prairies on a vertical cliff. Here we have Liatris aspera, or a blazing star, again, quite literally on a vertical cliff, overlooking the Cumberland Gap. So very, very unique treeless grasslands. The vertical grasslands are ones we haven't really figured out, and it's kind of a new frontier of grassland research that is on fire right now, but very exciting. So that kind of concludes our prairies. Now, I'm not joking, probably hundreds of more examples of prairies that I can give you, but I only have so much time today. I feel like I could teach like a 6-semester course on this. It's so exciting and fun to me. But I wanted to share some of the other grasslands as well. So we start merging and shifting right into savannas. Savannas at one point were considered like transitional habitats, but that's entirely not true. These are long-term stable communities that are dominated by oaks or pines that are well spaced out and are generally very, very old at times. In times of instability, savannas can have extensive areas of shrubs or tree resprouts. But when they're most stable, they have these mature trees with this sea of grass under them, like you see here. Here is an example of a post oak savanna in the fall on Fort Campbell Army Base. Here is one of my favorite savannas. So this is at a very close personal friend of mine's home in the less flat and till plains of Iowa. Just bur oak savanna we've been restoring for many years now. There's a doggy back there. His name's Huck. He tends to appear in all my pictures of this savanna. But very unique systems that are dominated by these bur oaks. You can see that in the overstory here, there's only one tree species. At this site, there is some hickory in the overstory, but the biodiversity of these systems, they are not in the trees. They are on the ground. Much more diverse, much more diversity on the ground than in the overstory of any of these savannas. Here we have a hydric savanna from the Atlantic coastal plain. These are dominated by longleaf and shortleaf pines. The reason that it's important to understand that the diversity in these systems are on the ground is because when they were first interpreted, many people called them pine forests or oak forest or oak hickory forest, and calling them a forest is kind of a misnomer if they only have 1 or 2 tree species in the overstory and the diversity is entirely on the ground. These are grassland systems that have trees in them but are not, true forested ecosystem. They are not shade-loving ecosystems. They are entirely majority reliant on open canopies, fire, and grazing, and some edaphic conditions. Here's a blackland savanna from Clark County, Arkansas. That is a post oak in the background right there that is very, very old. Here is a longleaf pine savanna from Brunswick, North Carolina. As you can see, the shift between oak savannas and pine is that you are able to have more pines on a pine savanna than you would oak due to their growth structure. But you can see that there's ample light on the ground here in this kind of sea. Prototypical, you think of like these longleaf pine savannas as having wiregrass. But a lot of them have different species of big bluestem and Indian grass. These are true savanna ecosystems. Here's one of our kind of typical oak savannas in Trigg County, Kentucky. You can see Indian grass and little blue stem dominate the ground layer here. Here's a pine savanna. This is actually a loblolly pine savanna. Most people don't think about loblolly in their native range. They're perfectly at home here within the black belt of Alabama. You can see all the gray-headed coneflower and just this diverse profusion of flora on the ground here. In the southeast, we had many different types of savanna that had savanna obligate species like red cockaded woodpeckers. I'm going to speed up a little bit here because we're running a little bit short on time, and I want to try and get through as many grasslands as possible and then still leave some time for questions. Here's another example of a post-oak savanna / woodland, depending on where you're standing. So where the picture is that I'm taking here, I would be standing in the savanna area looking towards what is more woodland, and you can see the sea of Echinacea pallida and other species blooming. Very stunning landscapes. So then we shift into woodlands. What's important is most people consider woodland forested systems, and there are forested woodlands and then there are open woodlands. Forested woodlands are characterized by having shade-loving conservative species on the ground. Open woodlands are characterized by having sun-loving conservative heliophytes on the ground, and there's an important distinction there. Woodlands, at least in the east, would have been one of the most common kind of grasslands probably around that wouldn't have had as an intensive a fire return interval, but would have still had this very important and very diverse mosaic of grasses and forbs and shrubbery on the ground. You can see we get a little bit more covered by trees, but still giant open spaces on the right where you have that top-down view. Here's a great example of an oak shortleaf pine woodland from Contusa WMA in Tennessee. The entire ground layer has that dappled sunlight with heliophytic or sun-loving species throughout. Here's a great pine woodland from Virginia. You can see all the Indian paintbrush and conservative heliophytes on the ground there in this cemetery remnant. Here is a Baroque woodland from the Central Irregular Plains in Iowa. This is probably one of the best standing Baroque woodland savannas left in the Great Plains region. It is owned by a private landowner and is stunning, covered in amorpha and tons of highly conservative species. Here's a oak hickory woodland in Arkansas in the background, blurred out. You can see my team is rolling out a tape to collect vegetation data here, and they recorded something like 90 plus species of heliophytic sun-loving plants within this one woodland plot. And then, of course, we truly had forests. Now, these forests would have been close canopied. They may have some fire-tolerant species, but generally they're covered in fire-intolerant species like maple and beech, and would not have had a very active fire return interval, like we're talking about maybe once in 100 to 200 years. And a lot of them look quite like this, an old-growth mesic hardwood forest. You can see we're deep in a gorge in Fall Creek Falls State Park. So if we had in this country these millions and millions of acres of grasslands, you know, what happened, what's left? So this is imposed just on the southeast to communicate how quickly grasslands started disappearing, even before we were able to settle areas like Iowa and Wisconsin and the further west. So by 1750, the majority of the Atlantic Gulf coastal plain had about 95% of their grasslands were gone. By the 1800s, we pushed across the Cumberland Gap and the Appalachians and really kind of wreaked havoc on all of Piedmont grasslands and Ridge and Valley grasslands. By 1860, we pushed the majority of the way across the southern plains, really about about the Mississippi River. By 1930s, all these grasslands were gone, and then so on and so forth. In some parts of the Midwest and the true West, the wave of grassland loss was accelerated through the 1800s and into the early 1900s. Similar to this, in that they were just utilized and relied on very heavily. And the moment that European contact was set foot onto the continent, we started changing these grasslands very rapidly, and they degraded very rapidly. And what we're often left across the range of grasslands in the country are with grasslands that were either too rocky or too wet to farm or develop, or to really graze intensively, which creates this kind of paradigm of a lot of our grasslands in this country are quite literally living on the edge. So what are we losing along with these grasslands, not only in the South, but overall? We have watched since the 70s, we've seen a 53% decline in grassland birds overall. We're talking about millions and millions of birds. We're watching the decline of bumblebees, with species like the rusty patch bumblebee and the American bumblebee. American bumblebee now being extirpated from 7 states. Rusty patch bumblebees generally being highly tied to remnant grasslands because they require the earliest flora and the latest flora to really subsist through their life cycle. Monarch butterfly up for petition for ESA listing. What we're communicating here is ecological collapse of our North American grasslands that kind of has already happened, but is still actively happening. We've seen the bison removed by the vast majority of its range. Prairie chicken range absolutely decimated. What once would have extended into Long Island, New York, now is relegated to parts of the West and parts of the Midwest. Just absolute ecological collapse. In the East alone, half of all endangered ecosystems are grasslands. There's 118 grassland systems in the East that are endangered. If you include woodlands into that metric, which we do, 70% of grasslands east of the Mississippi are endangered. And what do we have to risk here? This is exactly what we have to risk. This is the heath hen, or a subspecies of the prairie chicken that is extinct. It died on Martha's Vineyard, if anywhere. This is a picture of the Hempstead Plains of Long Island, New York. The majority of people don't even know existed, that were just wiped out alongside this prairie chicken. The last subspecies, the last individual of this subspecies died on Martha's Vineyard. His name was Booming Ben, because he boomed and all the females were gone. So we are very much looking across our grasslands in this country at ecological collapse and the potential of, in our lifetimes and our next lifetimes, to watch a vast majority of these get wiped off the face of the earth. The sad thing is, we talk about this wave of grassland loss and the decline of grasslands as if it's something that we've stopped. It's not. We are actively seeing more and more grasslands develop, disturbed, destroyed every single day. And I'll leave you with this. It's important that we shift our thinking. We are very good in this country and other countries of thinking about endangered species like the panda and the snow leopard and the whooping crane. But what we need to understand is the endangered species are these grasslands. These grassland remnants all across this country, from the Palouse grasslands in Washington to the Atlantic coastal plain grasslands in the Carolinas. These are endangered species. They are charismatic and enigmatic of what this country is and what the ecosystems are like and supposed to be, and they support this extremely diverse assemblage of flora and fauna. And if, as a conservation industry or conservation group, we don't start viewing these very unique ecosystems as endangered themselves and start protecting them as we would a panda or a hellbender or a whooping crane, we're going to see the further degradation and eventual extinction of our grasslands across the country. Thank you.
Jeremy, thank you so much. This was such an educational, beautiful, and powerful presentation. So I just want to preemptively thank you for that. We do have a few questions that I'd love to relay over to you.
Yeah, will you guys stop sharing my screen real quickly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So one of the questions I believe is in relation to the dryline map that you shared, and wondering if where the trees can grow is based on the average precipitation or historical minimums. Precipitation seems to have varied recently. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so that would have been based primarily on historical data, but I do agree that the concern for shifting precipitation rates is changing, and that's going to have a dramatic impact on our grassland and the grassland communities. And it's happening at a rate that is so quick that if you're on either side of that line and it's becoming wetter or drier, there's not enough time to really fully adapt. And the bigger challenge there is if we still had, millions and millions of acres of contiguous grassland, there would have been these areas where the drier species could have filled in or the wetter species could have filled in. But in the fragmented landscape we live today, we have sites that are, not really responding super well to that. We see sites in the far west and the short grass, mixed grass, and even tall grass prairie ranges becoming ever more shrubbier, ever more have more trees. Part of that can be attributed to kind of improper fire regime, but a lot of that is also attributed to the fact that our moisture levels are shifting with climate change.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. There's a management question I'm wondering if you want to take on. I'm wondering, do you have guidance about how to manage black walnut trees that keep popping up in a prairie?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, without stepping on a site, I can probably give a recommendation that's okay or good. One of the things that we're really realizing now, and more evidence and research is coming about, is that a lot of the prevalence of trees within our grasslands are products of improper fire regimes. Or mistimed fire regimes, where we shift from this view of historical fire regimes, where the vast majority of our fire throughout the Midwest and the East and the West, frankly, would have occurred from about August through November, December, both culturally and naturally. And then the vast majority of our sites now are burned in the spring. And what that does is it creates a bunch of nutrient cycling and kind of throws the system out of whack. So my biggest, recommendation is if you're managing a grassland that's having reoccurring kind of sapling issues, that fall burn window and repetitive fall burning over a long time is going to be the best kind of remedy there.
Mm-hmm. Also along the lines of like nutrients in the soil and like pH in the soil, there's a question regarding if you're restoring a previous agricultural field, does SGI attempt to adjust the soil pH, thinking about fertilization with ammonium nitrate, acidifying the soil?
So we definitely the less fertilizer in a system for a grassland reconstruction is the better. Some things that we've attempted on small scales, but it's not really we haven't been able to impact on like large scales, like using biochar to try and add carbon to the system. That's something that's very rapidly expanding within the restoration world of trying to figure out how to do that. But generally, I tend to take the very long-term window approach of if I'm going to do a grassland reconstruction from agricultural views, I'm going to, one, focus on creating the most diverse conservative seed mix that I can, and then as quickly as I can start getting that on a native, a natural kind of fire regime of fall fires to start pulling some of that nitrogen out of the system with repeated fall fire.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think we'll end with one more question here. And you had at the end of your presentation a really, really great call for us to think about these ecosystems and the flora and fauna on them as, you know, as endangered as some of the other things that we think about, like polar bears and stuff like that. Do you have any guidance on how we can either individually or collectively prioritize prairies and savannas and really share the message that we need to care for these ecosystems?
Absolutely. I think that one of the frustrating things for me, at least in my career, is that we see the vast majority of conservation dollars in the country at times go to wetlands and forests. Those are, for lack of a better term, semi-easy to conserve because they don't take a lot of the nitty-gritty management that a grassland does, right? You don't need to be out there every day weeding or burning your true mesophytic forests. So in order for us to have that shift in the country that I would like to see in my career, it's going to take multiple things. It's going to take a lot of research and science to accurately understand where and what grasslands are. It's going to take a conservation and understanding from a political and like everyday person view. We need to win the suburban moms and dads that maybe never will walk through a grassland. We want them to think about grasslands the way they think about polar bears and panda bears and these great kind of campaigns we've seen with other endangered species. And then lastly, there is no amount of funding in the world that will be enough to help manage every grassland. So what it's going to come down to is volunteering, getting people involved, not just you, but your neighbor. And maybe that means some Sundays during the week, you don't get to, during the football season, you don't get to watch Green Bay play and you go out and you volunteer on a prairie. But that's what it's going to take. It's going to take empowered, passionate volunteering to really go out and secure these small remnants and impact them and steward them into the next generation.
I love that message. What a wonderful way to end this presentation, I think, Jeremy. And for those of you who hear that message and want to take action, have a look at our events calendar. There are a lot of work parties that each of our chapters are doing all throughout the year to help manage these ecosystems. So get involved. All right, Jeremy, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much. There are a couple additional questions that we didn't get to, so hopefully you're able to answer that. But I just want to appreciate everyone for being here. And our next session will start at noon. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.